It was a Thursday afternoon in September of 1942, and Private First Class Noboru Takahashi was sitting on the edge of a coconut plantation on the island of New Britain when a boy of perhaps 10 years old walked out of the tree line, looked at him for a long moment, and handed him a mango. Takahashi had been on New Britain for 6 weeks. He had spent those 6 weeks in the specific institutional isolation that the Imperial Army's regulations prescribed for its soldiers in occupied territory. The careful, supervised distance from the local population that the Army's administrative culture maintained through a combination of formal regulation and informal social pressure, rooted in the conviction that the local population of every occupied territory was a potential source of intelligence, a resistance of the kind of human connection that compromised the soldiers' operational reliability and blurred the institutional boundaries that military authority required to remain distinct. The regulations were clear. The social pressure was continuous. And for 6 weeks, Takahashi had followed both with the compliance of a man who understood that compliance was the path of least institutional friction. The boy with the mango was not interested in Takahashi's regulations. He stood at the edge of the plantation with the specific confidence of a child who has decided that the large armed man sitting on the ground is more interesting than he is. Frightening, and he held out the mango with the directness of someone for whom the gesture required no explanation. Because in the culture the boy came from, offering food to a person who was present was not a complicated social transaction requiring careful institutional analysis. It was simply what you did. The person was there. The food was available. You offered it. Takahashi took the mango. He would spend the next 30 years trying to explain what that meant. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. The Imperial Japanese military's relationship with the populations of the Pacific territories it occupied between 1941 and 1945 was not a simple story, and it was not a story with a single character. It was a story of institutional policy and individual deviation, of official prohibition and human reality, of a specific gap that exists in every military occupation between what the command structure prescribes and what the men who live inside the occupied territory actually experience when the regulations are not watching. The official policy was control, the management of local populations through a combination of administrative authority, economic exploitation, and the physical presence of armed men whose institutional role made their relationship to the local population a relationship of power rather than a person-to-person contact. The individual reality was more complicated, more varied, and in the accounts that have survived in the oral histories and the memoirs and the testimonies of both Japanese veterans and Pacific Islander communities, more human than the official policy acknowledged or the subsequent historical narrative of the Pacific War's brutality has consistently represented. To understand both dimensions, the official prohibition and the human reality that existed alongside and beneath it, one must understand the specific ideological framework within which the Imperial Army organized its soldiers' relationship to the populations of occupied territories. The framework was not primarily racial in the explicit biological sense that National Socialist ideology had made the organizing principle of German occupation policy in Europe, though racial hierarchy was present in the imperial system's assumptions about the relationship between Japan and the peoples it was incorporating into the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It was primarily hierarchical and instrumental, a framework in which the local population's value was measured by its contribution to Japanese strategic objectives, and its management was organized around the extraction of that contribution with the minimum disruption to the military's operational requirements. The co-prosperity sphere's official ideology presented Japan as the liberator of Asian peoples from Western colonial domination, a narrative that had genuine resonance in some territories where the experience of Dutch, British, or American colonial rule had created authentic grievances that Japanese propaganda could address without entirely fabricating the premise. In the Pacific Islands specifically, in the territories of New Guinea, the Solomons, New Britain, New Ireland, and the scattered island groups of Micronesia that Japanese forces occupied in the opening campaigns of the Pacific War, The relationship between the official ideology and the lived experience of the local population was complicated by the specific character of Japanese military occupation, which tended, in practice, toward the extraction of labor and resources rather than the liberation of colonial subjects. The gap between the co-prosperity sphere's ideological promise and the operational reality of Japanese military administration was, in most occupied Pacific territories, significant and visible to the local populations experiencing it, and over time, visible to the individual Japanese soldiers whose daily contact with those populations provided a reality check against the institutional narrative they had been given. The soldiers who arrived in the Pacific Islands in 1942 and 1943 carried with them the institutional framework they had been given, the regulations, the social pressures, the ideological categories. And they also carried with them the same capacity for individual human response that institutional frameworks never entirely eliminate. They were young men, most of them, drawn from a Japan in which the preceding decade's militarization had been thorough, but not total, in which the civilian lives they had left behind had included the ordinary human range of relationships and experiences that the military's institutional totality was attempting to replace with a more controlled and more purposeful set of social connections. When those young men encountered the populations of the Pacific Islands they were occupying, the Melanesian communities of New Guinea and the Solomons, the Micronesian populations of the Central Pacific Islands, the mixed communities of territories where generations of colonial rule had produced complex social landscapes. They encountered human beings whose lives were organized around principles that the military's institutional framework had not prepared them for, that the framework's categories did not adequately describe. The Pacific Islander communities that Japanese soldiers encountered were not the passive, undifferentiated mass of occupied civilians that the military's administrative category suggested. They were communities with their own social structures, their own relationships to the land and the sea, their own aesthetic traditions and ceremonial practices and economic systems, communities that had been navigating the presence of foreign powers for generations and that had developed, through that navigation, a sophisticated capacity for assessing the specific character of the people who arrived among them and responding to individual human qualities that the foreigner's institutional affiliations did not always predict. The boy who walked out of the tree line on New Britain and offered Noboru Takahashi a mango was not making a political statement or a strategic calculation. He was doing what the community's social traditions prescribed in the presence of a person who was present, extending the hospitality that the culture encoded as the appropriate response to another human being's proximity, regardless of that human being's uniform or the institutional apparatus behind it. The Japanese soldiers who responded to these gestures, and the account from both sides indicate that many did across multiple islands and multiple campaigns, in the small daily transactions of occupation that the official record does not consistently document, were not making political statements either. They were responding to the specific, immediate human reality of a person who is treating them as a person rather than as a category, and finding that the institutional framework they had been given for understanding their relationship to the local population did not fully account for what that felt like when it happened. Takahashi took the mango because a child had offered it and because refusing it would have required more institutional resolve than the specific moment contained, and because the mango was a mango and he was hungry and the child was 10 years old and the gesture was simple and the regulations, in that specific instant, felt less real than the fruit in his hand. What happened after the mango was what happened after every small human transaction across the boundary that the occupation was supposed to maintain. It created an opening, not a dramatic one, not one that either participant would have recognized as historically significant at the moment of its occurrence, but an opening in the institutional boundary through which a relationship could develop if the circumstances permitted and the individuals involved were capable of the specific human flexibility that crossing an institutional boundary requires. The circumstances of the Pacific occupation did not always permit, and the individuals involved were not always capable. But across the documented record of the Pacific War's occupied territories, In the oral histories collected by Pacific Islander communities, in the memoirs of Japanese veterans who returned to the islands after the war, in the accounts preserved in the community memories of the Melanesian and Micronesian populations who lived through the occupation, a pattern emerges that the official record of the Pacific War does not prominently feature, but that the human record cannot avoid. Friendships formed, not universally, not without the coexistence of the violence and the exploitation and the brutality that the Pacific War's occupation history also documents with painful specificity. Not in a way that the friendship's existence should be used to soften or to complicate the honest account of what Japanese military occupation meant for the Pacific Islander communities who experienced it. But alongside all of that, in the spaces between the institutional demands and the operational requirements and the official prohibitions, individual human beings found each other and formed the connections that human beings form when the circumstances of their lives bring them into sustained proximity and when the institutional barriers between them are made of regulations rather than of walls. Sergeant Ichiro Yamamoto was stationed on Bougainville in 1943 and 1944, and his account of that period, preserved in a memoir he published in Japan in 1971 under a title that translates roughly as The Island That Stayed With Me, describes a relationship with a community elder named Silas that the memoir treats with the specific reverence of a man describing the most significant friendship of his life. Yamamoto had arrived on Bougainville as a signal specialist responsible for the maintenance of the communication infrastructure that connected the island's Japanese garrison to the broader command structure of the Southeastern Area Fleet. His work brought him into regular contact with the local population in ways that the regulations prescribed should be managed and supervised, and that in practice, as his memoir describes, were managed and supervised until the press of operational demands created the space in which they were not. Silas was a man of perhaps 55, a community leader whose authority derived from the combination of traditional social standing and the specific practical knowledge of the island's terrain, its weather patterns, its agricultural systems, its water sources, that had made him essential to the Japanese garrison's ability to function in a physical environment that none of its members had been prepared for by their training or their prior experience. The garrison needed what Silas knew. Silas provided it, with the pragmatic cooperation of a man who understood the calculation that the occupation had imposed on his community and who had decided, after the assessment of available options that the occupation's arrival had required, that cooperation with the garrison's practical needs was the strategy most likely to protect his community from the specific forms of violence that non-cooperation tended to produce. The relationship that began as a transactional one, Japanese garrison, needing local knowledge available from Silas, became, over months of daily contact, something that the transactional framework did not fully describe. Yamamoto's memoir is careful about what it claims for the relationship and honest about the asymmetry of power that the occupation created and that no individual friendship could dissolve. He does not present the friendship with Silas as evidence that the occupation was benign or that the individual human connections that formed within it compensated for the systemic violence that the occupation also produced. He presents it as what it was, a friendship between two specific men in specific circumstances whose existence did not resolve the moral complexity of the occupation's broader character, but whose reality was not negated by that complexity. Silas taught Yamamoto to navigate the island's river system by the specific sounds that the water made in different conditions. Yamamoto taught Silas to use the radio equipment that the garrison maintained, a skill that Silas would eventually use, after the Japanese withdrawal, to communicate with the Australian forces that replaced them. They ate together when the opportunity presented itself. They talked, in the improvised linguistic mixture of Japanese and Tok Pisin, and gesture that sustained communication in the absence of a shared language, about their families and their homes and the specific qualities of the places they came from and the specific qualities of the place they were both in. The food that they shared across the occupation's boundary, the yam and the taro that Silas's community produced from the island's soil, The rice and the occasional tinned fish from the Japanese garrison's increasingly strained supply was in its way the most direct expression of what the friendship represented. Food sharing, in the cultures of the Pacific Islands, is not a casual social transaction. It is a statement about relationship, about the decision to place another person within the social category of people whose sustenance you are willing to share in, whose physical well-being you are willing to contribute to, whose presence at your table you are willing to make real by the most concrete act of hospitality available. When Silas shared food with Yamamoto, he was doing something that his community's social framework assigned specific meaning to. When Yamamoto ate it, he was accepting that meaning, whether or not he understood its full cultural weight. And the yam that passed between them across the boundary that the regulations had drawn was, in its ordinary way, the same kind of argument about human connection that this channel has traced across every previous episode. The argument that the human capacity for relationship is more durable than the institutional frameworks built to contain it. The prohibition that the Imperial Army had placed on exactly these kinds of connections was not irrational within its own institutional logic. Military occupations that permit their soldiers to form genuine human connections with the occupied population create specific operational vulnerabilities. The divided loyalty that genuine friendship produces, the intelligent security risks that intimacy entails, the erosion of the institutional distance that makes the management of occupied populations through coercion and authority possible. The prohibition was designed to prevent exactly the human reality that Takahashi's mango and Yamamoto's friendship with Silas represented. The reality that individual human beings, placed in proximity to other individual human beings, tend to find each other regardless of the institutional categories that have been constructed to keep them apart. The prohibition failed, not universally, and not without the coexistence of the violence that the occupation also produced, but consistently enough that the record of the Pacific War's occupied territories contains, alongside its documentation of brutality and exploitation, a parallel and less prominent record of individual human connections that the institutional framework prohibited and that formed anyway. The record is fragmentary. It survives in the places that oral histories and community memories and the occasional memoir have preserved it, rather than in the official documentation that the prohibition ensured would not acknowledge it. But it is there, and its presence in the record is the evidence that the human capacity for relationship is not something that institutional authority, however comprehensive its ambitions, can entirely eliminate from the spaces between the regulations. The Japanese soldiers who had formed these connections faced a specific and painful reckoning when the strategic situation of the Pacific War made their withdrawal from the islands inevitable. The withdrawals that occurred across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal, from the Solomons, from Bougainville, from New Guinea, happened under conditions of military defeat that did not provide for the orderly management of the human relationships the occupation had produced. Men who had formed friendships with local communities left those communities without warning or without adequate warning, in a specific brutal compression of a military withdrawal that prioritized the survival of the unit over the management of every other consideration. The islanders who had formed those friendships were left with the specific experience of people whose relationships with individuals have been abruptly ended by institutional forces over which neither party had control, an experience whose emotional content the communities preserved in oral traditions that continued to acknowledge the individual Japanese soldiers by name long after the Imperial Army that had sent them had ceased to exist. Noboru Takahashi returned to New Britain in 1965. He was 46 years old, and he had spent the 23 years since 1942 in a Japan that had rebuilt itself from the rubble of the wars, ending into something that resembled but did not replicate what had been there before. He went back because the mango had stayed with him, because the specific human transaction of that September afternoon in 1942 had remained present in his memory with a vividness that the years of post-war reconstruction had not diminished, and because the boy who had handed him the mango was a man now, and Takahashi wanted to know who that man had become. He found him. The man's name was Samuel. He was 33 years old, and he did not remember the specific afternoon with the mango, He had been 10 years old, and the afternoons of his childhood contained many Japanese soldiers, each one indistinguishable from the others in the compressed memory of a child navigating an occupation. But he remembered, with the specific clarity that community oral tradition preserves, the stories his mother had told about the Japanese soldier who had sat on the edge of the plantation and accepted the food she had sent him with her son, and who had bowed in the specific Japanese gesture of acknowledgement and respect before eating it. The bow had stayed in the community's memory for 23 years. Not because bows were unusual or because the gesture carried any particular weight within the Pacific Islander cultural framework, but because the gesture had communicated something that the institutional context of the occupation had made remarkable. The recognition of the person offering the food as a person whose offering deserved acknowledgement, whose generosity merited the specific physical expression of gratitude that the Japanese cultural tradition encoded in the lowering of the head. Takahashi had bowed to a 10-year-old boy on a plantation in 1942. The bow had been preserved in the community's memory for 23 years. And when Takahashi returned in 1965, and the community's memory and the individual's search found each other on a New Britain afternoon, the specific human transaction that had begun with a mango and a bow completed itself in the only way that transactions of that kind can complete, in the recognition by both parties that the connection had been real and that its reality had outlasted the institutional framework within which it had been forbidden. Freedom finds its expression in the strangest places and through the strangest instruments. Sometimes it is a proximity fuse or a drop tank or a bulldozer on a ridgeline. Sometimes it is the capacity of a 10-year-old boy to walk out of a tree line and hand a mango to a soldier whose regulations said he should not accept it, and the capacity of that soldier to accept it anyway, because in the specific moment of the gesture, the human reality of what was being offered was more present than the institutional reality of what was being prohibited. The mango did not change the war. It did not dissolve the occupation or resolve its violence or redeem its brutality. But it created, in the space between the prohibited and the actual, a human connection that the prohibition could not prevent and that the years could not erase. And that connection, small, specific, preserved in the memory of a community and the memoir of a man, is the evidence that the human capacity for relationship is not something that history, however violent its ambitions, can entirely subtract from the record of what people did to each other and for each other in the years when the world was trying to make relationship impossible. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. Noboru Takahashi and the boy who handed him a mango, and the community that remembered the bow for 23 years, they deserve to be remembered. We found them.